people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Okay, we'll start with this. What is our last look at the Yokasta Valle versus Yadira Bustillos fight set to go down tomorrow on the undercard of Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua. Yokasta Valle, the reigning champion, 33 years old, to young Yadira, who's 25. Both fighters are orthodox fighters. Scheduled for 10 rounds in the women's minimum weight division for what is Yokasta Valle's WBC title. Yokasta Valle, who sports a professional record of 33 wins with 3 losses and no draws, 10 knockouts, having never been knocked out in 36 professional bouts, a 3-weight world champion and a 2-time minimum weight world champion. The fighter that I would argue is the best in show in the minimum weight division, to Yadira Bustillos, who sports a professional record of 11 wins with 1 loss and no draws, 2 knockouts, having never been knocked out in 12 professional bouts. Her lone defeat several fights ago to Germany's own Sarah Borman. Very active fighter in a round, like Yokasta Valle is a very active fighter in a round. That's what costed Yadira the fight. She got outworked 2 years ago in May of 2023. She has since rebounded off that loss. She's fought 4 times since then and won 4 times since then. Last in action earlier this year in February against Tamara DeMarco, who she stopped in the 7th round of a contest scheduled for 8. Now she's facing Yokasta, who was last in action in March of this year opposite the ring Marlen Esparza, former champion Marlen Esparza, 2 divisions north of where this contest is taking place, and Yokasta was able to win a split decision in what turned out to be her final fight of her existing Golden Boy Promotions contract. She has since migrated over to MVP, and this will be her MVP debut. So it just so happens that MVP has 2 of the 3 champions at this weight signed on their side of the street. There's Yokasta, who I just mentioned, but there is also Kim Clavel, this division's IBF champion. Back over to Yokasta and Yadira. Put simply, I think Yokasta's too experienced for young Yadira Bustillos and too active within a round. It was activity that allowed Sarah Borman to beat Yadira Bustillos, and I think it's going to be activity that allows Yokasta to do the same thing. I expect that Yokasta will be the busier fighter in the fight and allow her to pile up the rounds on that premise. I believe that she's going to outwork Yadira Bustillos, who is a solid, all-around, good fighter, making it somewhat unfortunate that I think she's about to suffer her 2nd professional loss. I think that Yokasta Valle is about to outwork her. I think that tomorrow night, Yokasta wins a points decision. And beyond that, there's only one way to go. There are 2 other champions at this weight, and I expect that if Yokasta wins tomorrow, she's gonna make it her mission to target them. It's either Sarah Borman, this division's unified WBA and WBO champion, or Kim Clavel, the IBF champion, who's right there on the same side of the street as Yokasta, for what would be an in-house fight relatively easy for MVP to make. Pick your poison. Because I believe the mission for Yokasta still is becoming this division's undisputed champion. And even though it's a competitive landscape, she is arguably the best in show in the minimum weight division. So there's a strong chance that she could actually do it. This could break down one of 2 ways. Yokasta wins tomorrow, then goes straight into a unification match, or Yokasta takes care of her mandatory challenger, Umi Ishikawa, while Kim Clavel unifies with Sarah Borman, and then Yokasta faces the winner. Then we get undisputed. As stated, this is a competitive landscape with many good fighters in it. You could give Yokasta Valle reasonable odds to be the last woman standing once the dust settles, but we'll see what happens beyond tomorrow. First, Yokasta's got to beat Yadira Bustillos, and I think she's going to do it. Elsewhere in the world of boxing, upon hearing news of Terence Crawford's retirement, former 5-weight world champion Oscar De La Hoya had some choice words for Terence upon his departure, saying, "What a tool. I can name 4, 5, or 6 fighters that compete and probably even beat him. Please. 2 good fighters he beat. Congratulations." This kind of took me by surprise because I've never known Oscar to have an axe to grind with Terence Crawford. This is the first time I've seen him take shots at Terence. Oscar usually takes shots at everybody. Over the years, he's taken shots at Floyd Mayweather for beating him, taken shots at Canelo Alvarez for leaving him, taken shots at Dana White for running a bigger and better, more successful business, taken shots at Eddie Hearn for no other reason than he's a foreigner. Oscar taking shots at people is no isolated incident, but it did seem somewhat out of left field that Terence announces his retirement and now Oscar chooses to start with him? Why?
What the fuck did Terence do to you?
Well, the truth is that Oscar is a fucking loser and a junkie. I mean, if we're gonna call a spade and try to surmise Oscar De La Hoya's behavior, it has everything to do with him being a fucking failure. A loser.
Let's start with Oscar De La Hoya's career. While it is true that Oscar was a 5-weight world champion like Terence was a 5-weight world champion, the difference between Oscar and Terence are the career blemishes. Oscar fought a lot of good fighters, most of which beat him.
I get so fucking sick of Oscar patting himself on the back, giving himself a participation award for having fought so many fighters, many of which beat him.
You still gotta win the fight, Oscar. Otherwise, you're just a high-profile journeyman.
6 recorded losses, 2 by way of knockout. Lost to Manny Pacquiao, lost to Floyd Mayweather, 2 losses to Shane Mosley.
That's where you and Terence are different, Oscar. The career blemishes. You've got a lot of them.
Where you guys are different. You went up to the middleweight division and got folded up like a beach chair by Bernard Hopkins, where Terence went a step further up to super middleweight and outboxed that division's undisputed champion.
That's where you guys are different, and you think you can criticize him?
Terence finished out his career unbeaten and a champion at 5 weights, having become an undisputed champion, where you finished out your career getting your fucking ass kicked by Manny Pacquiao. And I don't want to hear any excuses for Oscar, because Oscar was a younger man in the Pacquiao fight than Terence was in the Canelo fight. Oscar was 35 years old when he fought Manny. Terence was 38 when he fought Canelo.
You went out sad, Oscar. That's the truth. The truth is, you're in no position to criticize Terence because he had a better career than you did.
I'm not some young guy who heard about Oscar De La Hoya via digital media, watching old videos on YouTube. I was there. I saw it. Oscar De La Hoya lost most every big fight he ever had. So before you turn your nose up at Terence Crawford's career, why don't you reflect on your own? Why don't you reflect on how you dropped the ball in the Felix Trinidad fight? If you ask a lot of people, they'll tell you Oscar arguably won.
Arguably.
Where nobody needs to argue about who won the Spence fight or who won the Canelo fight. That's what sets you apart. That's where Terence is different. You gotta argue about who won De La Hoya versus Trinidad, who really won De La Hoya versus Sturm, De La Hoya versus Pernell Whitaker, De La Hoya versus Ike Quartey, whereas with Terence, you don't have to argue.
Because he's a better fighter than you ever were. And I know some people haven't processed it yet, but he's already had a better career than you had. You were never a 3-time undisputed champion like Terence. You never made that history.
Because you were never consistent enough. Oscar was never good enough to be that kind of fighter. And as stated, a lot of his most high-profile fights, a lot of the big ones, are the ones that he lost.
Stop me when I tell a lie.
Manny Pacquiao, Floyd Mayweather, Felix Trinidad, Bernard Hopkins, Shane Mosley 2 times.
Stop me when I tell a lie.
He said that Terence only has 2 good victories on his CV, where I think that applies more to Oscar than it does to Terence. The win over Fernando Vargas and the win over Ricardo Mayorga, both of which pale in comparison to Terence's win over Errol Spence Jr. and Canelo Alvarez. The difference between Terence and Oscar is whenever Terence did have a big fight, he left no doubts.
The difference between Terence and Oscar: Oscar tries to become a middleweight champion, gets folded up like a lawn chair. Terence tries to become undisputed at super middle, and he actually does it. That's what sets you apart, and that's why Oscar is in no position to turn his nose up at Terence Crawford's career.
Terence doesn't have any gifts over anybody like what you got with Ike Corte, with Felix Sturm, to a lot of people with Pernell Whitaker, because Terence never needed the gifts. You did.
People want to harp about what they think is missing from Terence Crawford's resume, largely in part due to the politics of boxing, where Oscar was never subject to those politics. In his time, Oscar was not avoided like Terence was avoided. Oscar was most able to get any fight that he wanted.
People weren't running from him like those welterweights were running from Terence Crawford.
No, because Oscar was the cash cow. There was a line around the block of guys who wanted to fight Oscar, where they never wanted to fight Terence that bad.
The difference between Terence and Oscar: Oscar was never subject to the politics of boxing. Oscar was not an avoided fighter. He was able to fight a lot of guys, a lot of which beat him.
So if you want to think of Oscar as being an accomplished fighter, you can, but he's not as accomplished as Terence Crawford. If you want to think Oscar was a good fighter, you can, but he wasn't better than Terence Crawford.
Look at how you finished out your career at 35, and look at how he finished out his at 38. He went out on top. You went out sad.
Sad.
And that's just the career stuff, the inside of the ring stuff. What about the outside of the ring stuff, Oscar? You're a fucking junkie. Outside of the ring, you're a cross-dressing weirdo getting extorted by Russian prostitutes.
Your own fighters hate you.
Nobody in the sport of boxing even takes you seriously anymore. You're so indignantly stupid. Why is it that when DAZN debuted in America, instead of enlisting Oscar De La Hoya as their point man, in the United States, they decided to go with a Brit?
Because Oscar's a fuck-up. Because Oscar is a junkie.
I mean, think about it. You're debuting in America, and you feel that a British promoter would make a better point man than Oscar De La Hoya himself, the golden boy? Leave it to me to say the quiet part out loud. Oscar's a fuck-up and an imbecile, and I'm a little bit tired of him sitting on his high horse trying to wag his finger in everybody's face to tell them what they're doing wrong. Your company is failing, Oscar.
DAZN may give you the boot in the coming calendar year due to your failures, and if they do, what are you gonna do? Go play golf?
Strained relationships with most every flagship fighter that he's had. With Canelo Alvarez, with Ryan Garcia. If Ryan could leave you, he would, at the drop of a hat. And if that day comes, who are you gonna replace him with? Alexis Rocha?
You don't need to worry about Terence and his career. You need to worry about your company. But that's your problem, Oscar. You're so focused on what are supposed to be everybody else's failures.
You forget to take stock of your own.
I was with a manager the other day who told me about an offer that they've made to one of their fighters. I couldn't believe how bad the money was.
There's a big determining factor in Zuffa's success and ability to take over the U.S. market as far as I'm concerned. What they're kicking out to the fighters versus what fighters are willing to accept those terms. Dana White has already amassed a less than favorable reputation among combat sports athletes, a reputation that has constantly been highlighted since the surge of Zuffa Boxing.
And what's constantly being used against him.
Now, I still think that even if Zuffa isn't kicking out what a Matchroom is kicking out, or Queensberry, or somebody else, they can still acquire a good number of fighters to add to their stable, but it's the caliber of those fighters you have to consider. Remember that in the sport of boxing, the top earners really encompass only a small percentage of the overall active boxers, and there are a lot of boxers out there, an ocean of them, that are making next to nothing. So for them, Zuffa can offer stability,
chance to fight on a regular basis for decent money, respectable money, perhaps not as much as a Conor Benn is making, or a Shakur Stevenson, some of these more big-name fighters, but still, there are a lot of boxers that might be able to benefit from what Zuffa has to offer.
But when you're talking about those kinds of boxers, their limitations are already set before them. You're not talking about the kind of fighters that can go all the way, go on to become pound-for-pound greats, and I never expected that Zuffa would acquire that caliber of talent. Just the other day, there was an image of Nick Khan and Dana White at a recent USA Boxing tournament, seemingly scouting top amateurs, perhaps fighters they would like to bring into the fray. The issue is that those top amateurs, out of the amateurs and into the pros, are going to be offered lucrative contracts by other promotional outfits, perhaps for more money than Zuffa is kicking out.
And that's a problem.
If you're talking about a fighter that goes to the Olympics and gets the bronze, gets the silver, or perhaps gets the gold, that fighter is likely going to be offered a lucrative contract by a Matchroom, by a Queensberry, a Top Rank, if they can get back on their feet. So that unless Zuffa Boxing is prepared to pay to play and kick out big money for big signings, there's a cap on how far they can go. There's a cap on how much success they can have, even with all the money that they have behind them and the brand power. It all boils down to the strength of the stable.
You know, familiarity is a big deal in the sport of boxing, especially among Americans who are highly xenophobic and picky eaters.
They won't watch just anybody. They don't watch boxing for the sake of boxing. There has to be a storyline, there have to be characters, and a sense of continuity, to where if all Zuffa is picking up are outliers and fringe contenders, fighters that the Americans aren't really that familiar with, they're not going to be that interested. And so Eddie Hearn says that he's got a whiff of the kind of money that Zuffa intends to kick out to the fighters. Some fighters that might be gatekeepers, that might be journeymen, might be able to make more money being the B-side to a Matchroom fighter, a Queensberry fighter, a Top Rank or Golden Boy Promotions fighter. And those fighters may not sign to Zuffa.
I don't say any of this from a desire to see Zuffa Boxing fail. I don't actually want them to fail. I want to see what they've got. I want to see what they bring to the table. But that is a reality that I think isn't being addressed enough. What you pay the fighters determines what fighters you can get.
Which to me is more important than any amendments they're trying to make to the Muhammad Ali Act. That's a real determining factor. What are you going to be paying the fighters? Because the fighters want to get paid. And depending on who the fighters are and what they can do, that will determine whether or not they sign to you. What seemed to me to be overestimations about Zuffa's brand power, buying power, and them potentially running all the other game in town out of business. I don't think so. Not unless you're prepared to pay to play. Not unless you can really spend to beef up your stable. Because that's what it would take, at least in part.
And even then, it's not a guarantee. Nothing really is in this industry.
I believe that Zuffa can be successful within its own borders, in its own way. But running everybody else out of business, I just don't see that, even on a long timeline. Too many variables, and boxing as an industry has too many moving parts for any one entity to control it.